One night, one drink, one kiss that started a fire. She couldn't control. The martini glass trembled in Sarah Chen's hand as she watched her ex-husband Marcus walk out of the downtown Seattle law office with his new wife, a blonde 20-something who looked like she'd stepped off a magazine cover. The divorce papers were finally signed, the custody battle lost, and Sarah's 6-year-old daughter Emma would be moving to Los Angeles with them next month. "One more, please," Sarah whispered to the bartender at Whiskey and Rye, the upscale lounge where she'd retreated after the most devastating day of her life. The amber liquid burned as it went down, but nothing could match the fire of losing her little girl. The rain pelted against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown establishment, creating rivulets that distorted the city lights into abstract art. Sarah had chosen this place specifically because it was the opposite of everywhere she and Marcus used to go. No memories here, just expensive liquor and strangers who wouldn't ask questions about why a 32-year-old woman was drinking alone on a Wednesday night. "Rough day?" The voice came from her left, smooth and genuinely concerned rather than predatory. Sarah turned to see a man in his late 30s, dark hair slightly mussed, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His tie was loosened, and there was something in his green eyes that looked as weary as she felt. "You could say that," she replied, surprised by her own honesty. Usually she deflected personal questions from strangers. "Daniel Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "And before you ask, yes, I'm also having the kind of day that requires top-shelf whiskey and questionable life choices." Despite everything, Sarah found herself almost smiling. "Sarah Chen, and I think I've got you beat on the questionable choices front." Daniel signaled the bartender for another round. "Try me." There was something about him. Maybe it was the genuine warmth in his voice, or the way he wasn't looking at her like she was a potential conquest, that made her want to talk. "I just lost custody of my daughter. She's 6 and she's everything to me. Her father's taking her to LA because apparently his tech startup money can buy better lawyers than my graphic design freelance income." Daniel's expression shifted to something deeper than sympathy. "I'm sorry, that's brutal." "What about you? What brings you to the land of expensive alcohol therapy?" He was quiet for a moment, swirling his whiskey. "Found out today that someone I trusted, someone I considered family, has been systematically embezzling from my company, not just taking money, but destroying lives. We had to lay off 40 people because of the budget shortfall." Sarah studied his profile. There was real pain there, the kind that came from betrayal rather than just financial loss. "Your company?" "Hayes Industries. We manufacture medical devices, things like portable dialysis machines for rural communities, prosthetics for veterans, the kind of stuff that actually matters, you know?" He took a sip of his whiskey, or at least it did, until my CFO decided his yacht collection was more important than our mission. Hayes Industries. Sarah's breath caught. She'd seen the name on billboards around the city, read about their charitable work in local newspapers. Daniel Hayes wasn't just some businessman having a bad day. He was one of the wealthiest men in Seattle, if not the Pacific Northwest. "You're that Daniel Hayes," she said quietly. He turned to face her fully, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe? "Yeah. And you're about to get uncomfortable and make an excuse to leave." But Sarah surprised them both by staying put. "Actually, I was going to say that makes it worse. When you're used to having nothing, betrayal stings. When you're used to being able to trust people because you can provide for them, I imagine that cuts deeper." Daniel stared at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Dollar signs in your eyes, a sudden interest in my hobbies or my lifestyle." He made air quotes, and Sarah could hear the bitterness from years of experience. "I design book covers for romance novels," Sarah said with a self-deprecating laugh. "I think I've read enough about billionaire love interests to know they're mostly fiction. Besides, I'm having my own crisis here. I don't have the energy to calculate your net worth." Something in Daniel's posture relaxed. He laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since she'd sat down. "Book covers. That mustn't actually really cool. What's the most ridiculous title you've had to work with?" "The Billionaire's Secret Baby Alpaca Ranch," Sarah replied without hesitation. Daniel nearly choked on his whiskey. That cannot be real. Oh, it's real. And it was a bestseller. Sarah felt some of the day's tension leaving her shoulders. When was the last time she'd laughed? Really laughed. The author insisted the alpacas needed to look mysteriously sexy. How does one make an alpaca mysteriously sexy? Very carefully and with a lot of mood lighting. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing with an ease Sarah hadn't experienced in years. Daniel told her about growing up in a working-class family in Tacoma, how his father had been a machinist at Boeing before being laid off in the 90s, how he'd built Hayes Industries from a tiny garage operation into a multi-million-dollar company, driven by the memory of his dad struggling to afford his mother's medical bills. Sarah found herself opening up in return, telling him about her daughter's laugh, her obsession with dinosaurs, the way she insisted on wearing mismatched socks because it makes my feet more interesting. She talked about her own childhood as the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who'd sacrificed everything to give her opportunities they'd never had. Emma sounds amazing, Daniel said softly. You must be incredibly proud. I am. Sarah's voice caught. I just wish I could give her everything she deserves. Marcus, my ex, he can afford private schools, trips to Disneyland, all the things I wanted to provide but couldn't. Money doesn't make someone a good parent, Daniel said quietly. Trust me, I've seen plenty of wealthy families that are completely broken. Emma has something more valuable, a mother who loves her unconditionally. The conversation was interrupted by Daniel's phone buzzing insistently. He glanced at it and frowned. I'm sorry, this is my assistant. She only calls this late if it's urgent. Daniel, thank God, came a woman's frantic voice through the speaker. The board called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Richard's trying to position himself as interim CEO while you deal with the scandal. He's telling everyone that your judgment is compromised. Sarah watched Daniel's face harden. Richard must be the embezzling CFO. Of course he is, Daniel muttered. Melody, can you push the meeting to afternoon? I need time to prepare. I tried, but 3 board members are flying out tomorrow evening. It has to be 9 a.m. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Okay, I'll be there. After he hung up, Sarah could see the weight of his responsibilities settling back on his shoulders. You should go, she said gently. Get some sleep before your battle tomorrow. I should, he agreed, but made no move to leave. This sounds crazy, but this has been the first time in months that I've felt like myself. Just Daniel, not Daniel Hayes, CEO, not Daniel Hayes, billionaire. To just encounter me. Sarah understood completely. For me too. I've been Sarah the failed wife, or Sarah the inadequate mother for so long, I forgot what it felt like to just be Sarah. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reluctant to break the spell. Can I ask you something that might sound presumptuous? Daniel said finally. Sarah nodded. Would you like to have dinner with me? Not at some fancy place where photographers might be lurking, just somewhere normal. Somewhere we can keep being just Daniel and Sarah. Every rational part of Sarah's brain screamed warnings. This man lived in a different universe than she did. This couldn't lead anywhere good. She had enough complications in her life. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her decision easy. Hope. The same fragile hope she felt flickering in her own chest. I'd like that, she said, but I have conditions. Daniel raised an eyebrow, amused. Conditions? No places with valet parking. No wine that costs more than my electric bill. And definitely no alpacas. His laugh was rich and genuine. Deal. Though I make no promises about the alpacas, they're surprisingly hard to avoid in Seattle. As they left the bar together, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before her marriage fell apart. Possibility. The rain had stopped, and the city lights reflected in the wet pavement like scattered diamonds. One night, one drink, one conversation, she murmured to herself as Daniel hailed a taxi for her. What was that? He asked. Nothing, she said with a smile. Just thinking about how quickly life can change. Daniel's eyes met hers as the taxi pulled up. For the better, I hope. As her cab pulled away from the curb, Sarah pressed her face to the window, watching Daniel's figure grow smaller. She had no idea that their chance meeting would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the price of happiness. The next morning arrived too quickly for both of them. Sarah woke in her tiny Capitol Hill apartment to Emma's video call from Marcus's downtown penthouse. "Mommy, Daddy's new house has a pool on the roof." Emma's excited voice filled Sarah's cramped kitchen as she balanced her laptop on the counter while making coffee. "That sounds amazing, baby," Sarah managed, her heart breaking at how easily Emma was adapting to Marcus's world. "Are you being good for Daddy and Jennifer?" "Uh-huh. Jennifer bought me new clothes and she's really pretty, and she smells like flowers, and she said we can get a puppy when we move to Los Angeles." Each word was another knife twist. Sarah had been promising Emma a puppy for 2 years, but their tiny apartment didn't allow pets and she couldn't afford the deposits and vet bills anyway. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I love you so much." "I love you too, Mommy. Daddy says I can visit you lots and lots." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her kitchen, staring at the acceptance letter from UCLA's graduate program in digital media that had arrived in yesterday's mail, the same day as her divorce papers. The program would have been her chance to build a better career, to provide more for Emma, but the timing was impossible now. She couldn't move to Los Angeles and compete with Marcus and Jennifer's perfect life, and she couldn't afford the program without selling the few assets she'd managed to keep in the divorce. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hope you slept better than I did. Still on for dinner. Daniel." Sarah stared at the message, torn. The responsible thing would be to cancel, to focus on figuring out her life, maybe look into those paralegal courses at Seattle Central College. Getting involved with someone like Daniel Hayes was a complication she couldn't afford, but as she looked around her tiny apartment, at the stack of unpaid bills on her counter, at Emma's drawings still taped to the refrigerator, at the life that felt like it was slowly shrinking around her, she realized that maybe a little complication was exactly what she needed. "I slept terribly, but yes, still on for dinner." "Where?" she texted back. Across town, Daniel was in his corner office on the 40th floor of the Hayes Industries building, but his mind wasn't on the emergency board meeting that would start in 20 minutes. Instead, he was thinking about Sarah's laugh, the way she'd listened without judgment when he talked about his father, the absence of calculation in her eyes when she looked at him. His assistant Melody knocked on the door. "They're ready for you in the conference room," she said gently. "Daniel, I have to ask, are you okay? You seem different this morning." Daniel straightened his tie and grabbed his suit jacket. "Different how?" "Less angry. Yesterday you looked like you wanted to burn the building down. Today you look—" She paused, searching for the word, hopeful. Before Daniel could respond, his phone chimed with Sarah's text. Despite the storm he was about to walk into, he found himself smiling as he typed back, "Dick's Drive-In on Queen Anne. Best burgers in Seattle, and I promise the wine list is terrible." The boardroom at Hayes Industries was a testament to corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a mahogany table that seated 20, original artwork on the walls worth more than most people's houses. But the atmosphere was toxic as Daniel entered to face 12 board members who held the power to remove him from the company he'd built. Richard Castellanos sat at the far end of the table, impeccably dressed as always, his silver hair perfectly styled. He'd been Daniel's CFO for 8 years, his children's godfather, the best man at Daniel's wedding to Catherine, a marriage that had ended 3 years ago, when she decided that being married to someone obsessed with saving the world was less exciting than being married to someone obsessed with spending money. "Gentlemen, ladies," Daniel began, taking his seat at the head of the table, "I'm sure Richard has filled you in on the situation." Board member Patricia Wong, a shrewd woman in her 60s who'd helped finance Daniel's early expansions, leaned forward. "Daniel, we've known each other for 15 years. Help me understand how you missed $8 million being systematically stolen from under your nose." "Because I trusted someone I considered family," Daniel replied evenly. "Richard had complete access to our financial systems because I believed he shared our mission." Richard spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and reasonable. "Daniel, I understand you're hurt and looking for someone to blame, but the forensic accountants have found discrepancies going back 2 years, discrepancies that your signature authorized." Daniel felt the trap closing around him. "Signatures you forged, Richard." "That's a serious accusation to make without proof," board member James Fletcher interjected. Fletcher was old money, Seattle establishment, and had never fully trusted Daniel's working-class background. For the next hour, Richard masterfully presented his case, how Daniel's recent behavior had been erratic, how he'd been making unauthorized humanitarian donations that stretched their budget, how the company needed stable leadership during this crisis. He had documents, financial records, even testimony from other executives about Daniel's emotional decision-making. What Richard didn't have was the flash drive in Daniel's jacket pocket, the one his IT director had given him that morning, containing metadata proving the forged signatures and traced the money trail to Richard's offshore accounts. But as Daniel listened to the man who'd betrayed him systematically dismantle his reputation, he realized something that surprised him. He wasn't consumed with rage anymore. Instead, he found himself thinking about Sarah's resilience in the face of her own betrayal, her grace under pressure, the way she'd found reasons to laugh even on the worst day of her life. "Richard," Daniel said quietly, interrupting a particularly eloquent speech about fiscal responsibility, "do you remember my father?" The question caught everyone off guard. Richard blinked. "Of course, Frank was a good man." "He was. And do you know what he told me right before he died? He said that a man's character isn't measured by how much money he makes or how high he climbs, but by what he does when no one is watching, by whether he lifts people up or tears them down." Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "For 8 years I trusted you with everything, not just money but the mission we built together. You've been in my home, around my family, part of every major decision that built this company." He turned back to face the room, and there was something in his demeanor that made even Richard shift uncomfortably. "You're right that I've been making emotional decisions lately. I authorized those humanitarian donations because I met a kid in Guatemala who needed a prosthetic leg, and our device gave him back his childhood. I pushed back our profit margins because I wanted to make sure veterans could afford our products. And yes, maybe that made me vulnerable to someone who saw dollar signs where I saw human lives." Daniel pulled out the flash drive and set it on the table. "But I'm not the only one who's been emotional, Richard. Greed is an emotion too. So is betrayal." Patricia Wong picked up the drive, examining it. "What is this?" "Metadata from every forged signature, bank records tracing the missing funds to accounts in the Cayman Islands registered under Richard's name, and email communications between Richard and our competitors about sensitive product information." The room went dead silent. Richard's face had gone pale. "You see," Daniel continued, his voice still calm, "while you were busy trying to destroy my reputation, I was busy being the engineer I trained to be. I followed the data, I traced the patterns, and I found the truth." James Fletcher was reviewing documents on his tablet, his expression growing darker by the minute. "Richard, these bank transfers, these correspond exactly with the missing funds. There has to be an explanation," Richard stammered. "Someone's framing me, trying to—" "Stop!" Patricia Wong's voice cut through his protests. "Richard, I've seen enough. Daniel, I owe you an apology. We all do." Over the next 30 minutes, the truth unraveled completely. Richard had been skimming money for 2 years, using his access to Daniel's accounts to forge authorizations. Worse, he'd been selling proprietary information to competitors, undermining contracts that would have brought medical devices to underserved communities. As security escorted Richard from the building, he turned back to Daniel with pure hatred in his eyes. "You think you've won? This isn't over. I know things about you, about your precious company, about the skeletons in your closet. You'll regret this." But Daniel felt no satisfaction in his victory, only sadness for the man he'd once considered a brother. That evening, Sarah stood outside Dick's drive-in, feeling ridiculously overdressed in her best jeans and the silk blouse she saved for client meetings. The iconic Seattle institution was exactly what Daniel had promised, No valet parking, no wine list, just honest food and formica tables that had seen decades of first dates, family dinners, and late-night conversations. Daniel arrived 5 minutes after her, looking nothing like the billionaire CEO from yesterday. He wore faded jeans, a University of Washington sweatshirt, and beat-up sneakers. His hair was mussed like he'd been running his hands through it, and there was something lighter about his expression. "So," Sarah said as they found a booth by the window, "how did your corporate battle go?" "I won," Daniel said simply, "but it doesn't feel like winning. Someone I cared about turned out to be someone else entirely. I'm sorry, I can relate to that feeling." They ordered 2 deluxe burgers, fries to share, and chocolate milkshakes that arrived in glasses so large they seemed like a throwback to the 1950s. The simple pleasure of good, uncomplicated food seemed to work magic on both of them. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, stealing one of his fries. "Yesterday you were this mysterious wealthy man, drowning his sorrows in expensive whiskey. Today you're buying me a $5 burger in a place that probably hasn't updated its decor since the Clinton administration. Which one is the real Daniel Hayes?" Daniel considered this, twirling his straw in his milkshake. "Both, I think. The weird thing about having money is that it amplifies everything. When you're sad, you can afford to be sad in really expensive places. When you're happy, you can buy happiness for other people. But the core feelings, they're the same as they were when I was eating ramen in my dorm room." "What made you want to build medical devices? I mean, there are easier ways to make money." Daniel's expression grew serious. "My mom had diabetes, not the manageable kind, the kind that slowly steals your life piece by piece. We couldn't afford the best treatments, the newest monitoring equipment. She died when I was in college, and I kept thinking, what if? What if the technology had been cheaper, more accessible? What if insurance companies weren't making life and death decisions based on profit margins?" Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, a gesture so natural she didn't even think about it. "She'd be proud of you. I hope so." Daniel looked down at their joined hands, seeming surprised by the contact, but not pulling away. "What about you? What made you want to design book covers?" "Honestly, I fell into it by accident. I was working as a graphic designer for a marketing firm, and one of our clients published romance novels. The pay was terrible, but there was something about creating images that represented people's dreams and fantasies. It felt important, like I was helping people escape, even if just for a few hours." "And now you're trapped designing mysteriously sexy alpacas?" Sarah laughed. "Don't knock the alpacas, they paid for Emma's preschool." They talked until the restaurant began closing around them, the conversation flowing from childhood memories to career dreams to their favorite books and movies. Sarah learned that Daniel was obsessed with old jazz records and terrible sci-fi movies. Daniel discovered that Sarah could speak 3 languages, had once spent a summer backpacking through Europe with nothing but a backpack and a Eurail pass, and that she made the best chocolate chip cookies in Seattle, according to her daughter's very discerning palate. As they walked to their cars, Sarah's ancient Honda Civic parked next to Daniel's surprisingly modest Tesla, the Seattle evening was crisp and clear, the kind of night that made the city feel full of possibility. "Sarah," Daniel said, stopping beside her car, "I have to be honest about something." Her heart sank. Here it came. The revelation that would pop this perfect bubble. He was married or engaged, or this had all been some kind of elaborate joke. "I haven't felt this comfortable with another person in years," he said instead. "Maybe ever, and it scares the hell out of me." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by her own fear. "Me too. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to turn into someone else, or for me to wake up and realize this was all some stress-induced fantasy. What if we agreed to just see what happens? No expectations, no pressure, just 2 people who enjoy each other's company." Sarah thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. The vast difference in their worlds, the custody battle that was slowly destroying her, the fact that she was in no position to start a relationship with anyone, much less someone whose life existed in the public eye. Then she thought about Emma, who would be gone in 3 weeks, about the empty apartment that awaited her, the uncertain future. the life that felt like it was slowly shrinking into nothing. "Okay," she said. "Let's see what happens." Daniel's smile could have powered the city. "Really? Really? But I still have conditions." "More conditions? You're a tough negotiator, Sarah Chen. I want to keep this private for now. I can't handle my personal life becoming public entertainment, especially while I'm dealing with custody issues. And I need you to understand that Emma comes first, always. If this gets complicated and starts affecting her..." "It ends," Daniel finished. "I understand completely. For what it's worth, I prefer privacy too. The last thing either of us needs is photographers following us around." As Sarah drove home through the familiar streets of Seattle, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning and grasping at straws, but the steady, warm hope of someone who suddenly saw new possibilities stretching out ahead. She had no way of knowing that across town, in a luxury apartment in Belltown, Richard Castellanos was placing a phone call to a contact at the Seattle Times, a reporter known for his particularly vicious celebrity gossip column. "I have a story for you," Richard said, his voice cold with revenge, "about Daniel Hayes and his new girlfriend, and trust me, it's going to be very interesting." The next few weeks passed in a blur of carefully orchestrated normalcy. Daniel and Sarah fell into a routine of quiet dinners, long walks through Pike Place Market, movie nights at Sarah's apartment where they debate the merits of Daniel's terrible sci-fi collection versus Sarah's romantic comedies. They were careful, meeting at out-of-the-way places, never arriving or leaving together, keeping their growing intimacy hidden from the world. Daniel would park his Tesla 2 blocks away and walk to Sarah's apartment. Sarah would meet him at small neighborhood restaurants where no one would expect to see Seattle's most eligible bachelor. The secrecy should have felt stifling, but instead, it felt precious, like they were protecting something fragile and valuable from a world that would try to tear it apart. Emma was scheduled to leave for Los Angeles in 10 days, and Sarah found herself clinging to every moment with her daughter, while simultaneously dreading the approaching goodbye. Daniel, without being asked, had started including Emma in their plans whenever she was with Sarah. "Uncle Daniel, look!" Emma called out as she raced ahead of them through the exhibits at the Pacific Science Center. They'd spent the afternoon exploring the interactive displays, and Emma had taken to Daniel with the easy acceptance of a 6-year-old who sensed genuine kindness. "She's incredible," Daniel said quietly, watching Emma explain the principles of aerodynamics to a group of stuffed animals she'd arranged as her students. "You've raised an amazing little scientist. I keep waiting for her to ask when she's going to see you again," Sarah admitted. "I don't know what to tell her." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. "What do you mean?" "Daniel, she's leaving for Los Angeles. I'll be lucky if I see her for more than a few weeks each summer. This thing between us. It's been beautiful, but it's not real life. Real life is custody schedules and financial constraints, and the fact that you exist in a completely different universe than I do." "What if you didn't have to choose?" Daniel asked quietly. Sarah stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "I've been thinking about this, about you, about Emma, about what happens next. I have business interests in California. I've been considering opening a West Coast office for Hayes Industries anyway. What if? What if we made this work?" "Daniel, you can't reorganize your entire life around a relationship that's barely a month old." "Why not?" "Sarah, I've spent the last 15 years building a company, accumulating wealth, achieving everything I thought I was supposed to want. And I've never been as happy as I've been these past few weeks. Emma needs her mother and you. God, Sarah, you make me want to be the best version of myself." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and her stomach immediately knotted with anxiety. He never called unless something was wrong. "Marcus? Is everything okay?" "Sarah, we need to talk. Can you come to the hotel now?" "What's wrong? Is Emma hurt?" "Emma's fine, but we need to discuss some things that have come to light about your personal life." Sarah's blood went cold. Beside her, Daniel had gone very still, clearly picking up on the tension in her voice. "What do you mean, my personal life?" "Just come to the hotel, Sarah, Suite 4012 at the Four Seasons. And Sarah, you might want to bring your lawyer. The line went dead. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the science museum, watching Emma play with complete innocence while her world began to crumble around her. "What happened?" Daniel asked gently. "I think," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, "the other shoe just dropped." An hour later, Sarah sat in Marcus's hotel suite, a sprawling penthouse with a view of Elliott Bay that probably cost more per night than her monthly rent. Marcus was there with Jennifer and their lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an Armani suit who looked like she ate opposition attorneys for breakfast. "Sarah," Marcus began, his voice carrying that patronizing tone she remembered from their worst fights, "I want you to know that this brings me no pleasure. Just tell me what's going on." Jennifer, who had been silent until now, slid a tablet across the coffee table. On the screen was a photo of Sarah and Daniel walking hand in hand through Pike Place Market, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a considerable distance. "We've received information that you've been involved with Daniel Hayes," the lawyer said crisply. "A relationship that raises serious questions about your judgment and your priorities as a mother." Sarah's mouth went dry. "How I spend my personal time has nothing to do with my relationship with Emma. Doesn't it?" Marcus leaned forward. "Sarah, this man is a billionaire. The power dynamic alone makes this relationship questionable. How do we know you're not being manipulated? How do we know you haven't been compromised?" "Compromised?" Sarah's voice rose. "Marcus, you left me for a woman barely older than your college interns. Don't lecture me about judgment. That's different. And you know it," Jennifer interjected, her voice sickeningly sweet. "We're talking about Emma's safety here. This Hayes person. Do you have any idea what kind of people might target a child to get to him? Kidnappers, extortionists, people who would use a little girl as leverage?" The lawyer opened a file folder. "We're prepared to file for an emergency modification of the custody agreement. Given the potential danger you've placed Emma in by involving yourself with a high-profile target, we believe it's in her best interest to limit your access to supervised visits only." Sarah felt the room spinning around her. "You can't be serious." "We're very serious," Marcus said. "Sarah, I don't want to hurt you, but Emma's safety comes first. If you end this relationship immediately and agree to stay away from Hayes permanently, we can forget this conversation happened. And if I don't?" The lawyer answered with clinical precision. "Then we'll present evidence to the court that you've recklessly endangered your daughter by associating with individuals who attract dangerous attention. We have witness statements about strange cars following you, unusual activities around your apartment building. The court will have no choice but to protect Emma's interests." Sarah knew they were lying, or at least exaggerating, but she also knew that Marcus had the resources to make his lies sound convincing in court. She could fight it, but legal battles took time and money she didn't have, and in the meantime, she could lose Emma entirely. "I need time to think," she said quietly. "You have 24 hours, the lawyer replied. "After that, we file the emergency motion." Sarah left the hotel in a daze, walking the streets of downtown Seattle without really seeing them. Her phone buzzed with texts from Daniel, but she couldn't bring herself to read them, much less respond. How could she explain that their beautiful secret relationship had been exposed and weaponized against her? By the time she reached her apartment, she'd made her decision. She typed out a text to Daniel, deleted it, rewrote it 3 times before finally hitting send. "We need to talk. Can you come over? It's important." Daniel arrived within 20 minutes, taking the stairs 2 at a time to her 4th-floor apartment. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "What happened?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. Through tears, Sarah told him about the photos, the threats, the ultimatum. Daniel listened with growing anger, his jaw tightening with each detail. "This is blackmail," he said finally. "Pure and simple. And it's exactly the kind of thing Richard would orchestrate." "Richard? My former CFO. He threatened revenge when the board fired him. This has his fingerprints all over it. The private investigator, the photos, feeding information to Marcus's lawyer." Daniel began pacing her small living room. "Sarah, we can fight this. I have resources, connections, legal teams that make Marcus's lawyer look like a first-year law student." "No." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "Daniel, I can't. I can't risk losing Emma completely. Not even for this. So what are you saying? Sarah looked at this man she'd come to love because that's what it was, love, she realized with brutal clarity, just as she was about to lose him. I'm saying that maybe Marcus is right. Maybe I was selfish to think I could have this. Emma needs stability, not a mother whose personal life makes her a target. Sarah, that's exactly what they want you to think. They're counting on you being so afraid that you'll walk away from your own happiness. My happiness doesn't matter if it costs Emma her safety. Daniel stopped pacing and knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. What if I told you there was another way? What if I could guarantee Emma's safety, provide security, make sure she never has to worry about being targeted because of her connection to me? Daniel, you can't promise that. You can't control every dangerous person in the world. No, but I can level the playing field. Sarah, marry me. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. What? Sarah whispered. Marry me. If you're my wife. If Emma is legally my stepdaughter, then she's under my protection completely. Marcus can't use our relationship against you if it's legitimate, legal, permanent. And more than that, Daniel's voice grew softer, more vulnerable. Marry me because I love you, because these past few weeks have been the happiest of my life, because Emma deserves to have a father figure who would move mountains for her, and you deserve to have someone who sees your strength, your intelligence, your incredible heart. Sarah stared at him, overwhelmed. Daniel, we've known each other for a month. I knew I loved you after our second conversation. I knew I wanted to spend my life with you when I watched you help Emma build that volcano model for her school project, when you stayed up all night because you refused to let her down. Time doesn't create love, Sarah. Recognition does. This is insane. People don't get married to solve custody disputes. People get married for all kinds of reasons: convenience, family pressure, business arrangements. Why not love? Why not the desire to protect the people who matter most? Sarah pulled her hands free and stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the alley behind her building. Because when marriages that start as business arrangements fall apart, people get hurt, and I can't survive being hurt like that again. What if it doesn't fall apart? What if instead of focusing on all the ways this could go wrong, we focused on the ways it could go right? Sarah turned back to face him. You're asking me to bet Emma's entire future on a relationship that's barely a month old. I'm asking you to bet on us, on the connection we have, on the future we could build together. Sarah, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Remember, you have until tomorrow evening. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Daniel read the message over her shoulder, his expression hardening. Let me handle Marcus. Let me handle all of this. By marrying me? Daniel, that's not a solution, that's a fairy tale. Then let's write our own fairy tale. Let's show Emma that sometimes the impossible can happen, that sometimes love really does conquer all. Sarah looked at this man, who had walked into her life at her lowest moment, and somehow made her believe in possibilities again. The rational part of her brain was screaming warnings, but her heart was whispering yes. If I said yes, she said slowly, and that's a huge if. What would that actually look like? How would we make this work? Daniel's eyes lit up with hope. We'd do it right, a real wedding, not some courthouse quickie. Your parents could fly in from Portland. Emma could be your flower girl. We'd build a life together, slowly, carefully, with respect for what you and Emma have been through. And if it doesn't work, if 6 months from now we realize we've made a terrible mistake, then we handle it like adults, with counseling first, and if that doesn't work, with the most amicable divorce in Seattle history. But Sarah, what if it does work? What if this crazy, impossible thing turns out to be the best decision either of us ever made? Sarah closed her eyes, trying to think clearly. When she opened them again, Daniel was still there, still looking at her with that expression of complete vulnerability and unwavering certainty. Ask me again, she said quietly. Sarah Chen, Daniel said, his voice steady and sure. Will you marry me? Will you let me love you and Emma and build a life together? Will you take this leap of faith with me? And somewhere in the depths of her heart, Past the fear and the rational objections, and the voice that sounded suspiciously like Marcus telling her she wasn't good enough for this kind of happiness, Sarah found her answer. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Daniel's kiss was soft and desperate, and full of promises they'd spend the rest of their lives learning how to keep. Outside, Seattle sparkled in the darkness, full of 8 million stories of people taking chances on love, on hope, on the possibility that sometimes the impossible could happen. And in a tiny apartment on Capitol Hill, 2 people who had found each other against all odds began planning a future that neither of them could have imagined just a month before. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and bright, a rarity in Seattle's typically overcast November. Sarah stood in the bridal suite of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, wearing her grandmother's pearls and a simple but elegant dress she'd found at a boutique in Fremont. She'd insisted on paying for it herself, one of many small battles Daniel had graciously lost in their whirlwind 2-week engagement. Emma twirled in front of the mirror, her flower girl dress a cloud of pale pink tulle. "Mommy, do you think Uncle Daniel will like my dress?" "He'll love it, sweetheart. But remember, after today you can call him Daniel or Dad if you want to. He's going to be your stepfather." Emma considered this seriously. "Can I call him Daddy Daniel, so I don't forget my other daddy?" Sarah's heart squeezed with love for this resilient little girl who was handling the upheaval in her life with more grace than most adults could manage. "That sounds perfect, baby." The wedding was small. Sarah's parents, who had flown in from Portland looking bewildered but supportive, Daniel's sister and her family from Vancouver, a handful of close friends and colleagues. Notably absent was Marcus, who had agreed to let Emma participate only after Daniel's lawyers made it clear that attempting to interfere would result in a legal battle Marcus couldn't win. The ceremony took place in the hotel's garden court, surrounded by evergreens and late-blooming roses. Daniel waited at the altar in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the entrance with barely contained emotion. When Sarah appeared at the end of the aisle, Emma skipping ahead of her with a basket of rose petals, Daniel's composure finally cracked. His eyes filled with tears and his smile was so bright it could have powered the city. The vows they'd written together were simple but profound. "Sarah," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly through the garden, "3 weeks ago I thought I knew what I wanted from life. Success, respect, the satisfaction of building something meaningful. You showed me that I'd been thinking too small. You and Emma have given me something I didn't even know I was missing. A family, a purpose beyond profit margins, a reason to come home at the end of each day. I promise to love you both fiercely, to protect you always, and to never take for granted the gift of your trust." Sarah's voice was steady despite her tears. "Daniel, you walked into my life during the darkest period I'd ever experienced, and somehow you helped me find light again. You saw strength in me when I felt weak, possibilities when I saw only dead ends. You didn't just fall in love with me. You fell in love with my daughter, my complicated life, my uncertain future. You chose all of it. All of us. I promise to build a life with you based on honesty, respect, and the kind of love that grows stronger with each challenge we face together." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel's kiss was soft and reverent, mindful of their audience but full of promise for the life they were beginning. The reception was held in the hotel's Georgian room, elegant but not ostentatious. Daniel had insisted on keeping everything low-key, knowing that Sarah was still adjusting to the reality of being married to someone whose net worth made headlines. During the father-daughter dance, or in this case, stepfather-stepdaughter dance, Emma stood on Daniel's feet while he swayed gently to "What a Wonderful World." Sarah watched from the sidelines, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "She's going to be okay," her mother said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. "Both of you are." "I hope so, Mom. This all happened so fast. Sometimes I wonder if I've lost my mind." "Maybe you have," her mother said with a smile. "But sometimes losing your mind is the only way to find your heart. That man looks at you and Emma like you're his whole world." As if summoned by their conversation, Daniel appeared beside them, Emma now perched on his shoulders, giggling as she played with his hair. "Mrs. Hayes," he said formally to Sarah, "may I have this dance?" The use of her new name sent a thrill through Sarah that surprised her. "You may, Mr. Hayes." As they swayed together on the dance floor, Emma safely settled with Sarah's parents at a nearby table. Daniel whispered in Sarah's ear, "Any regrets?" Sarah looked around the room, at Emma, safe and happy and surrounded by people who loved her, at her parents, who were deep in conversation with Daniel's sister about grandchildren and holiday plans, at the life that had materialized around her like magic in the span of a month. "Just one," she said softly. Daniel's face fell slightly. "What?" "I regret that it took so long for you to find me." His answering smile was radiant. "We found each other exactly when we were supposed to, not a moment sooner, not a moment too late." As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself watching Daniel interact with their guests, how he listened intently to her father's stories about immigrating from Taiwan, how he patiently answered Emma's endless questions about everything from seahorses to space travel, how he seemed genuinely interested in everyone's lives and experiences. This wasn't the cold, calculating billionaire from the romance novels she designed covers for. This was a man who had somehow remained humble despite extraordinary success, who used his wealth as a tool for connection rather than separation, who had chosen love over convenience at every turn. Near the end of the reception, Daniel found Sarah on the terrace, looking out at Elliott Bay under the stars. "Thinking?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About how surreal this all is. A month ago, I was a single mother facing the worst day of my life. Now I'm married to you. Emma gets to stay in Seattle for school, and I'm trying to process the fact that our life just completely changed. Do you remember what you said to me that first night? About how quickly life can change?" Sarah leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the reality of this new life they were building. One night, one drink, one conversation, one kiss, Daniel added softly, pressing his lips to her temple. One kiss that started a fire neither of us could control. Inside the hotel, the last of their guests were saying their goodbyes. Emma had fallen asleep in Sarah's mother's arms, worn out by excitement and sugar, and the joy of being the center of attention. Tomorrow they would move into Daniel's house in Queen Anne, a compromise between his Mercer Island estate and Sarah's Capitol Hill apartment, chosen specifically because it was in Emma's school district and had a yard perfect for the puppy Emma had been promised. But tonight Sarah stood in her husband's arms and marveled at the unpredictability of love, at the way the universe sometimes conspired to bring together two people who needed each other desperately, even when they didn't know they were looking. 6 months later, Sarah sat in her home office, a sun-filled room overlooking Puget Sound that Daniel had designed specifically for her work, putting the finishing touches on her latest book cover design. This one was for a contemporary romance called The CEO's Second Chance, and she couldn't help but smile at the irony. Her phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Emergency board meeting running late. Can you handle Emma pickup? I'll make it up to you both with dinner at that new pizza place she's been talking about." Sarah typed back, "Of course. See you at home." Home. The word still gave her a thrill, even after 6 months of marriage. The house on Queen Anne had become their sanctuary, a place where Daniel could shed the weight of corporate responsibility, where Emma could run through the halls with their new golden retriever puppy, Rex, where Sarah could build her growing freelance business without worrying about rent or utilities, or the 1,000 small financial stresses that had defined her old life. But more than the physical comfort, it was the emotional security that amazed her. She and Daniel had settled into a rhythm of genuine partnership, sharing household responsibilities, parenting decisions, and the daily challenges of blending their very different worlds. The transition hadn't been without bumps. Emma had gone through a phase of testing Daniel's authority, seeing how far she could push her new stepfather. Sarah had struggled with the loss of financial independence, even though Daniel had insisted she maintain her own bank account and business. They'd had their first real fight about money when Daniel had casually mentioned hiring a full-time housekeeper, and Sarah had felt like he was trying to erase her self-sufficiency. But they'd worked through each challenge with patience, communication, and the kind of commitment that came from choosing each other deliberately rather than falling into love by accident. Sarah's business had grown exponentially, partly due to Daniel's connections, but mostly because of her talent and the confidence that came from not desperately needing each client. She'd been able to be more selective, taking on projects that excited her artistically, while turning down the alpaca-adjacent work that had once paid her bills. As she drove to Emma's school, Sarah reflected on how different this routine had become. 6 months ago, she'd been driving her ancient Honda, stressed about gas money and praying the car would start. Now she drove Daniel's second Tesla. He'd insisted she needed something reliable, and the worst traffic jam couldn't dampen her mood, because she knew she was heading home to a family that loved her. Emma bounded out of Lowell Elementary with her usual enthusiasm, her backpack bouncing as she ran toward the car. "Mummy, guess what happened in science class today?" "What happened, sweetheart?" "We learned about volcanoes, and I told Mrs. Peterson about the volcano we made, and she said maybe Daddy Daniel could come talk to our class about engineering stuff." Sarah's heart warmed at Emma's casual use of her chosen name for Daniel. The little girl had adapted to their blended family with remarkable resilience, and the relationship between Emma and Daniel had grown into something beautiful and authentic. "I think Daddy Daniel would love to talk to your class," Sarah said. "You'll have to ask him at dinner." As they drove through the familiar streets of Seattle, Emma chatted about her day, her friends, her plans for the weekend. This was the life Sarah had dreamed of during those dark months of custody battles and financial stress. The simple pleasure of picking up her daughter from school, of having nowhere urgent to be except home. When they arrived at the house, Daniel's car was already in the driveway. Sarah found him in the kitchen, still in his suit, but with his tie loosened, standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven. "You said pizza," Sarah said, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "I lied. I thought I'd try making that Thai curry you love. Emma's helping by being my official taste tester." Emma, perched on a stool at the kitchen island with a spoon in her hand, nodded seriously. "It needs more coconut milk, Daddy Daniel." "More coconut milk it is," Daniel said solemnly, adding another splash to the pot. This was what happiness looked like, Sarah realized. Not the dramatic, overwhelming passion of romance novels, but this quiet, domestic contentment, the knowledge that someone cared enough to cook her favorite meal after a long day, that her daughter felt secure enough to boss her stepfather around in the kitchen, that she belonged somewhere completely and without reservation. After dinner, while Emma was upstairs doing homework and practicing piano, Sarah and Daniel sat on the deck overlooking the water, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the ferries cross Elliott Bay. "How was the board meeting?" Sarah asked. "Good, actually. We finalized the partnership with that non-profit in Guatemala. By next year, we'll be providing prosthetics to rural communities at cost." "That's amazing. Your father would be proud." Daniel smiled, the expression still tinged with sadness when he talked about his parents. "I hope so. Some days I feel like I'm finally living up to the example he set." "Speaking of examples," Sarah said, "Emma wants to know if you'll come talk to her science class about engineering." "Of course, I love talking to kids about science. They ask the best questions. No corporate politics, just genuine curiosity." Sarah studied his profile in the fading light. Even after 6 months of marriage, she sometimes caught herself marveling at the fact that this brilliant, kind, generous man had chosen her and Emma. "Penny for your thoughts," Daniel said, noticing her scrutiny. "Just thinking about how different things are now. 6 months ago, I was barely holding my life together. Now I'm married to my best friend. Emma is thriving, my business is growing, and I wake up every morning excited about the day ahead. It feels almost too good to be true." Daniel turned to face her fully. "Sarah, can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" She nodded, suddenly serious. "The night I met you, I had been planning to step down as CEO of Hayes Industries." Sarah's eyes widened. "What?" "Richard's betrayal, the financial mess, the realization that I'd built this company but had no real life to speak of. I was planning to hand control over to the board and disappear somewhere. Maybe teach engineering at a small college, try to figure out who I was without the money and the responsibilities." "What changed your mind?" Daniel took her hand, running his thumb over her wedding ring. "You did. Emma did. That first night when you talked about your daughter's laugh, about wanting to give her everything she deserved. I realized I'd been thinking about success all wrong. It wasn't about building something impressive or accumulating wealth. It was about using what you had to protect and provide for the people you loved. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Daniel, I'm not saying I married you to save my company. I married you because I fell in love with your strength, your resilience, your capacity for joy, even in the middle of crisis. But loving you and Emma gave me purpose again. It reminded me why Hayes Industries mattered, not as a monument to my ego, but as a tool for making the world better for people like Emma. Sarah leaned over and kissed him, tasting wine and promises on his lips. I love you, she whispered against his mouth. I love you too, both of you, more than I ever thought possible. As the stars appeared over Seattle, Sarah felt the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, at exactly the right time. Inside the house, Emma practiced piano scales with determined concentration, the notes floating out onto the deck like a soundtrack to their quiet happiness. Rex, the golden retriever puppy, dozed at their feet, twitching occasionally as he chased dream rabbits through imaginary fields. This was their life now, not perfect, but real, built on choice rather than chance, on commitment rather than convenience, on the radical idea that sometimes love really could conquer all, one small, brave decision at a time. As they headed inside to help Emma with her bedtime routine, Sarah caught Daniel's hand, stopping him in the doorway. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For seeing me, for choosing us, for proving that fairy tales can come true, even for skeptical single mothers who design mysteriously sexy alpacas for a living. Daniel's laugh was rich and warm, the sound of a man who had found exactly what he didn't know he was looking for. Thank you for taking the chance, for saying yes when every rational part of your brain was screaming no, for showing me that the best investments aren't measured in dollars and cents, but in laughter and bedtime stories, and Sunday morning pancakes. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the maternity ward of Seattle Children's Hospital, holding their newborn son while Daniel read Goodnight Moon to Emma, who was perched carefully beside them in the hospital bed. The baby, James Daniel Hayes, named for both their fathers, slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, oblivious to the way his arrival had completed their family in ways none of them had anticipated. He's so little, Emma whispered in wonder, gently touching her brother's tiny fist. Do you think he'll like dinosaurs? I'm sure he will, Daniel said solemnly, especially if you teach him about them. Emma beamed with the pride of a big sister, already taking her responsibilities seriously. Sarah looked around the room, at her husband reading to her daughter with the same attention he gave corporate presentations, at the baby who would grow up knowing nothing but security and love, at the life that had grown around her like the most beautiful, impossible garden. The fire that had started with one night, one drink, one kiss, had grown into something sustainable and warm, something that would burn steadily for the rest of their lives. Not the desperate flame of people trying to escape their circumstances, but the steady glow of people who had found their way home to each other. Outside the hospital windows, Seattle sparkled in the distance, full of millions of people living their own stories of love and loss, hope and heartbreak. Somewhere in the city, there were probably other people sitting in bars, sharing their worst days with strangers, not knowing that sometimes the most impossible love stories begin with the simple act of being honest about your pain. Sarah had learned that happily ever after wasn't a destination you reached, but a choice you made every day. To be brave, to be vulnerable, to believe that love was worth the risk of heartbreak, to trust that sometimes the universe conspired to give you exactly what you needed, exactly when you were ready to receive it. As she held her son and watched her husband and daughter plan elaborate schemes for teaching baby James about the wonders of science and literature and the proper care of golden retriever puppies, Sarah smiled at the beautiful unpredictability of it all. One night, one drink, one kiss that had started a fire she couldn't control. Thank God she hadn't tried to.